Okay, as we noted last time, George Washington chose to retire after 2 terms, setting that 2-term tradition in place. That was later made a part of the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951 that officially limited a president to 2 terms. Nevertheless, with his retirement, there will be an election then in 1796. We are going to see John Adams, the sitting vice president, squaring off against the former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, both as candidates for the presidency. Now, you may remember that these guys are the leaders of these 2 emerging parties, Federalists and Republicans, that had begun to kind of come together during Washington's 2nd term, but they're not running as members of a party in this election. Again, they're both running for president, and under the system at that time, the one who got the most electoral votes became president. That will be John Adams. The one with the 2nd most votes in the Electoral College became vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Nevertheless, these guys are opposed to one another on an awful lot of things, and we're going to see Jefferson as one of Adams's harshest critics at times during this presidency. Now, John Adams is going to be a 1-term president. He'll serve for 4 years. And what we're going to see is that over that 4 years, the country was preoccupied with the threat of war. Only this time it's not a war with Britain. This time it was the possibility of a war with France. Problem was that the French had begun to seize and loot American ships. And we're talking here merchant ships, trade ships, ships that are taking goods for sale from the United States to Europe and vice versa. But the reason for all of this, why it's France seizing American ships, isn't France and the United States, aren't they allies? The problem was because of Jay's Treaty. Now you remember Jay's Treaty, signed during Washington's 2nd term, a treaty with Britain that at least was an attempt to bring down some of the tensions between the 2 countries that had reached a crisis point over the issue of impressment. As we noted before, Washington was quite happy with that treaty, even though it never addressed impressment directly, because it did bring down the tensions between Britain and the United States, and there would be no war between the 2 at this point. But France was not so happy. France was America's ally. You know, these 2 nations had become allies by treaty during the Revolutionary War. The United States, we should note, could never have beaten the British in the Revolution without France. And France, remember, is Britain's enemy. And so France doesn't like Jay's Treaty. Why is our ally, the United States, signing a treaty with our enemy, Britain? You know, why are they trying to make nice with Britain? France's enemy. And so France retaliates against the United States by beginning to seize and loot American ships. And by the time that Adams takes office as president, about 300 American ships had been seized and looted since Jay's Treaty had been signed. Now, the hardcore Federalists, people who believed in the ideology of the Federalist Party, they want war with France over this, because you may remember the Federalists opposed the alliance with France. They want to end it. They'd rather ally with Britain. Adams, we should note though, like Washington, believes that the United States could not withstand a war with a major European power. And so Adams wants to solve this problem with France through diplomacy, through negotiations. And so he sent 3 American diplomats to France, to Paris, to ask for negotiations to begin between the two countries so they could resolve this problem. Now, the person that these American diplomats needed to speak with was this guy, Charles Talleyrand. He was the French foreign minister. Think of it like the American Secretary of State, right? In charge of foreign affairs and chief diplomat for the nation. These American diplomats needed to set up meetings with Charles Talleyrand to begin these negotiations. So our three Americans arrived in Paris, got hotel rooms, and began to make visits to Talleyrand's office to ask for a meeting. They were kind of brushed off each time they went. They sent letters to his office officially requesting time, and the negotiations began. Their letters were ignored. And 3 weeks went by like this, with the Americans trying to make their appeal to no avail. After 3 weeks, though, Charles Talleyrand sent 3 French diplomats over to see the Americans and make them an offer. Those 3 French diplomats told the Americans that Talleyrand would love to talk to them. Talleyrand would be happy to sit down with them to begin negotiations if the United States agreed in advance to loan France $10 million, and if the United States would make a personal gift of $250,000 to Talleyrand himself. Really? The United States has to guarantee a loan to France of $10 million, and they have to pay Talleyrand a personal gift of $250,000 before they'll sit down to negotiate. Now, I hope this sounds shocking to us today. At the time, it was fairly normal to have some money exchange hands for negotiations between countries, but this was a really high amount. It was a high bribe, really, that the French were asking of the Americans. That was a lot, even for them. $250,000 to Talleyrand himself. And so the Americans refused. No, we're not going to pay that. We're not going to do that. And in fact, they go home. They go home. They leave Paris. They go back to the United States without ever having begun the negotiations over this issue of French seizure of American ships. And once those diplomats got back to Washington, they wrote up a report. They told President Adams what had happened. And Adams writes up a report to be submitted to Congress. Now, Adams is pretty angry at this whole thing. And so when he wrote his report detailing the incident, he refused to dignify those French diplomats by using their names in the report. And so throughout the report, he referred to those French diplomats only as X, Y, and Z. I will not even dignify them by putting their names in this report. How dare they? How dare they try to extort a bribe? So this whole thing becomes known in history as the Xyz Affair. And once Americans hear what happened, the anti-French feeling in America grows stronger, and the calls for war with France grow stronger as well. Again, Adams does not want to go to war with anybody. Again, he does not believe the United States is militarily strong enough to fight a European power. He's right about that. He is going to resist a formal declaration of war. But we will see that Congress is going to take some actions against France after the Xyz Affair. So let's note, Congress is going to authorize American ships to capture any armed French ships that they encounter. Essentially, Congress is going to tell American ships, you capture them before they capture you. Second, Congress suspended American trade with France. No more business, right? No more goods being imported or exported from France. And third, and most significantly, Congress renounced the alliance with France. The alliance between France and the United States that had been made during the Revolution is ended. We're also going to see one more effect of the Xyz Affair, because as the French seizure of American ships continue, as American ships now are fighting back, we are going to see an undeclared war break out between the United States and France. It's known as the quasi-war, and it's not an official war. Quasi-war is like kind of a sort of a war, but there is fighting now between France and the United States on the seas over this issue. Now we're going to understand, though, that nobody is really very happy with how Adams is handling this issue with France. Those who are beginning to call themselves Republicans, they think that Adams hasn't done enough to work this out with France. Remember, the Republican Party believes very strongly in the alliance with France. They're pretty hacked off that Congress has ended that alliance with France. They don't think Adams is doing enough to repair that alliance. And the Federalists, they want a real war with France. None of this quasi-war stuff, they'd argue. Let's just declare war on France and have it out. Is it any wonder that John Adams is a one-term president? He kind of has everybody against him on this issue. But with all the anti-French hysteria in the country during this point in time, Congress in 1798 passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is just going to make matters worse. Now, the Alien Act part of this thing is anti-immigrant in nature, as you can see. To become a citizen of the United States, immigrants had to reside in the U.S. for 14 years. That's up from 5 years, as it had been previously. And the government can, under the Alien Act, deport what they consider to be enemy aliens. That section is really aimed at French people living in the U.S. But the Alien Act doesn't create much controversy. It's the Sedition Act that does. The Sedition Act, in a sense, is an attack on all of those people who are criticizing Adams's policies toward France at the time. Under the Sedition Act, it was illegal to write, publish, or say anything of a false, scandalous, or malicious nature against the government or governmental officials. It basically meant that the government would punish Americans for their expression of opinion if that opinion differed from that of the Adams administration. This is a test. Free speech, free press, under attack. If you write something, say something, publish something that is critical of the administration, of government officials, if they decided that it's scandalous or malicious, you can get in legal trouble. We're looking at censorship here. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, basic civil liberties under attack. But also remember that the Federalist Party, they believed that there were times that those basic civil liberties might have to be restricted. And I guess this is when, when people start criticizing our government, maybe that's when we crack down on things like free speech and free press. This was especially concerning to the Republicans, who were doing most of the criticizing of John Adams. Under the Sedition Act, they faced legal consequences if they criticized, and so the Republicans, again led by Jefferson and Madison, will formally protest the Alien and Sedition Acts. They're going to write 2 resolutions that would be adopted by Virginia and Kentucky. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in protest of the Alien and Sedition Acts. This central government is becoming too strong, they said. Is the government going to, is this government now so strong that they're going to oppress basic civil liberties? They believe it's the state's responsibility to step in and stop what they see as an abuse of government power. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions then made an argument in favor of what's called nullification. These resolutions state effectively that if Congress passes a law that a state believes is unconstitutional, a law that violates the Constitution, as they say the Alien and Sedition Acts do, then the state should have the power to nullify that law in their state, to declare it invalid. That the state should have the right to determine constitutionality of federal law. And if they determine that a federal law is in violation of the Constitution, the state should have the power to declare that law invalid in their state. This is an argument in favor of state power over federal power. That the states, in a sense, should have the right to decide that a federal law just doesn't have any effect in their states. Nullification. Now, No other state except Virginia and Kentucky adopted these resolutions. And so this challenge, in a sense, to federal power doesn't really go anywhere at this point in time. But the idea was out there, nullification. Should a state have the power to nullify a federal law? Who does have that power? Many argued, because there was nothing in the Constitution that gave that power to determine constitutionality of federal law to anybody. Now, next week we're going to see that power ends up in the Supreme Court. But this idea of nullification is going to hang on for a while. We're going to see it. We're going to see it again before we get to the Civil War. State arguments that the state should have the power to nullify a federal law. Now, let me just note at the bottom of that slide, states do not, nor have they ever had the power to nullify a federal law. But this is an argument that that is being debated at this period of time. Again, it's that question of how much power should the federal government have versus how much power should the states have. Nullification. So Virginia and Kentucky passed these resolutions in 1799, which tells us that by the end of Adams's 4 years as president, the tensions between the opposing parties, as they are strengthening, are becoming much, much more clear. And that leads us then to the election of 1800. In the election of 1800, for the first time now, we're going to see candidates declare themselves to be members of political parties. It's going to be Adams running for a second term as a Federalist. Right? These are the things I believe in as a Federalist. I support these things that my party stands for. And it's going to be Jefferson opposing him as a Republican. Right? These are the things Republicans stand for. This is, these are the things that Jefferson stands for. It's going to be a hard-fought election, although it's very different from anything we're used to today. I mean, in those days, candidates did not run around the country making speeches saying how great they were. That was just not done. Local people may make a speech in favor of one candidate or another. Lots of campaign literature was printed up by the parties and distributed to the people. We just don't have that same kind of face-off that we see today in modern politics. But this election did get a little bit nasty. But in the end, Thomas Jefferson wins. In the end, Jefferson defeated Adams for the presidency. And at this point in history, the Constitution faces another test. The party that had held the executive branch of government since the beginning of the Constitution, the Federalists, had lost to the opposition. Now, George Washington, as we already noted, opposed political parties. He never would say he was a Federalist or a Republican, but his actions as president would indicate that he was very much of a Federalist. So the Federalists, in a sense, then had indeed held the presidency from the beginning of the Constitution. Would the Federalists willingly give up power? Would there be a peaceful transition of power? Would the party in power willingly just hand over power to the opposition? You're just going to give your power to this person who totally is against everything you stand for? I mean, in Europe, they fight for power. There are wars over power. But under the Constitution, the winner of the election is supposed to now become president. Would there be a peaceful transition of power from one party to another? And the answer, of course, is yes. Yes, there was. John Adams set a very important precedent when he peacefully stepped down from the presidency. This election of 1800 will mark the first peaceful transfer of power between political opponents in the United States. And since then, the loser of every presidential election in U.S. history has willingly and peacefully surrendered their power to the winner. No matter what kind of political divisions might exist between them, no matter whether or not they hate each other or not, the Constitution has held. Peaceful transition of power after elections is a hallmark of American democracy. So Thomas Jefferson will become president. Next week, we'll take a look at his presidency.